Hi guys, my name is Echard, and I am going to be doing a book talk today on I Am Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter by Erica L. Sanchez. I think this is a great book to include in your high school classroom, and I'm going to go through the plot, the characters, and how I think you can include this. I think it's a great look into an immigrant story from Mexico and how culturally diverse it is and how we can bring that into the classroom. All right, so first we're going to start out with getting to know some of our characters. Julia is the main character in this book, um, and the story is told by her perspective. She's dealing with questions of her identity, not only as a person and growing up, but also as a Mexican and a daughter and a sister. And she's just trying to figure life out. She's really, really smart, loves English, and her dream is to become a writer and go live in New York City. Olga is her sister, who is considered the perfect Mexican daughter. She always wants to be with her family. Her and her mom are best friends. She never does anything wrong. Julie's been compared to her whole life. But the story starts with Olga being run over by a semi, which has the entire family torn apart and struck with grief. And Julia finds out throughout the book that maybe Olga isn't the perfect daughter that she always thought she was, and that maybe her sister was hiding more than meets the eye. And then Amma and Appa are Julia and Olga's parents. They immigrated from Mexico, crossing the border illegally, and so they have not been back to Mexico because of the fact that they don't have their proper papers and green cards and things like that. So Julia and Olga have visited Mexico, but not Amma and Appa because they've been stuck here in Chicago, where they immigrated to. And they made a lot of sacrifices to get here. A couple more characters is Angie. Angie is Olga's best friend, and Julia goes to her multiple times in the book to figure out what kind of secret life her sister is living. And Angie is she's also a very proper Mexican woman, works really hard at a hotel lobby, uh, tries to be good and respectful, and she thinks that Julia needs to just let her sister's death go, and she needs to leave things in the past. And then Julia's two best friends are Lorena and Huanga, who are Lorena has been her best friend since childhood. She's super loyal. Lorena really likes to be the life of the party, go out. She becomes friends with Hoenga through during high school, and he's very flamboyant and he's gay, and he takes them to all of these parties, and they just live this fabulous life. That Julia's not sure that she necessarily loves, but she does it because Lorena wants to be involved in this, and so she goes along with it. And then finally, we have Connor. Connor is a rich, upper class white boy from Chicago. He is going to Cornell. Eventually, you find out throughout the book. He really, really, really likes Julia, and they meet in a bookstore, and they both have the same interests, are interested in English. It's her first boyfriend. But eventually, he struggles to know the world that Julia comes from and what's going on with her and why her overbearing parents keep her kind of locked away from the world. And so their relationship struggles through that. Mr. Ingman is the English teacher, and he encourages Julia in her writing, says that she's great, pushes her to go to college, pushes her to be the best that she can, and he's really one of the only adults who truly sees her for what she wants to be. And then also Dr. Cook, who is Julia's therapist towards the end of the book. And she's also the only person, Julia says, who truly sees her. She kind of when Julia is saying things like I can't go to college, or my parents don't understand me, or things like that, she's the only person to kind of talk step by step over why is that happening, what is going on, why do you think this is happening, how can we fix this, and helps her really cope with just the mental illness and anxiety and depression that she deals with because of the grief of Olga's death. So the setting is in two places. It's mainly in Chicago, Illinois, here in the United States. Uh, Julia family lives in Chicago. They live in kind of a rundown neighborhood, a poor neighborhood that's very Mexican. So all the people who live around them are Latin American, or most of them are from Mexico. So there's a kind of familiarity with that. However, she does go to Los Ojos, Chihuahua, Mexico, which is where her family immigrated from, and she goes there after she is in the hospital for her mental illness. It's kind of a place where she kind of gets in touch with her roots of who she is, who her family is, the struggles that they had to cross the border, and how they continue to how that shapes her identity and things. So she learns a lot there. So the plot of the story is really, really cool. It's a coming of age story where Julia deals with trying to figure out her identity as both a Mexican and an American. She wants things that her family doesn't necessarily understand, especially her ama, who is a very traditional Mexican woman who believes that you grow up and you take care of your family, and you live for your family, and you live to serve your husband and your kids. Whereas Julia wants way more than that. She wants to be a writer. She wants to get out. She wants to get everything out of life and travel. She says multiple times she doesn't want kids, and she struggles because her sister is completely opposite and is very much like their mother, and loves their family and thinks that's the most important thing ever. So when she dies, there's a lot of identity crisis that Julia deals with, trying to figure out who she is, and um, just trying to deal with the fact that she's not Olga, and her mom and her will not have the same relationship that Olga and her mom did. But this whole book kind of goes through her growing up and figuring out what she wants to do, trying to get into colleges, the reading and the writing that she does in order to like figure out who she is and grappling with that question. Uh, she's trying to figure out how her sister died and the life that her sister hid away from her family. Um, and she finds out that maybe being the perfect Mexican daughter isn't the only thing that's out there and the perfect thing for her, and that maybe there's a mixture of the two that can make you happy. Um, she, of course, is growing up and finding things such as boys. She has her first boyfriend, and she's dealing with her role as a woman in a predominantly patriarchal society of Mexican culture, but also what that means for her as an American woman and a woman who wants to get out and be independent. And she's also trying to deal with grief and handling the relationships between her family and her friends, and with herself and who she is and who she wants to become. So I think that there is a lot to explore in this book, and I think it's great to have in your high school classroom, especially. I think it can be read by ninth or 12th graders, but there are a couple of topics discussed that I think you should be very wary of before diving into it. So it might also be a very good book, particularly for 11th and 12th graders, as Julia is a junior and senior throughout the book, and she talks about applying to colleges and dealing with her upcoming life and what that will look like outside of her family. So that can be especially relevant to them. I think, like I said, this book is great to add into the classroom because it does deal with certain topics that I think students are very aware of, and it can be used as a coping mechanism or a way to kind of a cathartic reading. That being said, there are a couple things that you may want to look through yourself. There is a suicide attempt, and rape is mentioned throughout the book. There is a lot of sexual activity that goes on, not incredibly explicit, but there is some. There's LGBTQ plus identity. There's a boy who is gay, and people who are trying to decide if they are or not. There's a lot of talk about illegal immigration because that is the story of her parents. There is shooting and gang-related activity and violence that's seen throughout the book. There is several instances of substance abuse, whether that be getting drunk or smoking weed. There is mention of drug lords and narcos trafficking. Even though it's kind of more of a background knowledge thing, it is mentioned. There is also several times that abuse is alluded to, sexual, physical, and emotional. It's not overt, but it is in there. And then I think two other things that we should be aware of is there's lots of profanity used, and also there's a lot of bilingual text in this, which can be great to enrich your vocabulary, but it's also a good thing to know going in so that you can have things looked at beforehand and be able to discuss that with your students. So 3 interactive learning activities that I suggest that you would do. I think that I would bring up the immigration policy and talking about immigration because it's such I think it will allow students who are not immigrants or maybe don't know a lot about that life. It will allow them to see what it's like on the other side and how immigrants have come to this country and how they're struggling to deal with everything that they need to do in order to work and provide for their family and why they came over here. So I think that opens up a lot of great areas for discussion. And I think it would be a great way to maybe have your students write a letter to the senator. Whether or not they actually send it or not, I think is up to you. But I think it's a good way to practice formal writing, but also arguing and debating and problem solving about an issue that is very prevalent in our world today. Another thing I would suggest is who I am and who I am becoming poster. I think this is really important as identity is a huge aspect of the book, and I think it will help your students to be able to figure out like who am I, especially upper high school level kids who are trying to make that transition into adulthood. I think it will help them kind of ruminate on what their life has been and who they want to be and how they want to achieve those goals. So whether you set that up like a visual board or an aesthetic board with maybe a couple paragraphs, with some personal writings about that, I think that's a good way to really engage how this book applies to their life. And then another thing, this book talks a lot about mental health and coping. So I would take a day and do mental health and coping stations. I'd set up different areas, whether that's creating little stress balls or going into areas in the book where she talks about how she copes with different things like breathing exercises, or whether it's creating uh, bullet journals with things to do when I'm depressed, and it's a list of things that make the student happy. I think this is a good way to not only use the mental health aspects of the book and reveal that, but also I think it's good skills that our students should have and something that I think gets overlooked in our curriculum a lot. So I would suggest doing something like that to just really help, and also just creating awareness of like allowing the students to be accountable with one another, that if somebody is going through this and looking for signs and like to help others out with that. So a couple of big ideas and essential questions I think that this book brings up are I'm going to go through those now. So a big thing is grief, And I think one of the things that you can pull out of the book is, how does grieving affect ourselves and those around us? Is it treated by others badly? Uh, uh, is treating others badly because of grief ever okay? I think that's something that Julia struggles with throughout the book, and I think it's great questions for your students to talk about. Mental health, Julia struggles with depression and anxiety, and it becomes too much for her. So I think it's important to talk about how our mental health correlates with how we act in life, and what's happening because of that. Um, also think it's important to talk about how do we deal with this in ourselves and others, more on how to be accountable and to help others out. Identity, I think that's something that a lot of high school students struggle with, especially as they're trying to maybe become different than who they were as they transition into the adult world, or they're still figuring out who they are. Um, so questions from this book that I think are really important to take is, how does my family culture and goals shape me into who I am and what I want to become? And also relating that, how they do that to Julia in the book, but also to themselves. Relationships is a key thing here in the book. I think it's important our students ask themselves, do different relationships shape how I behave in life? Is this good or bad? Can I see maybe unhealthy relationships? Or is my relationship with my mom affecting how I treat my sisters? So on and so forth. Truth and lies is something that Julia deals with, trying to once she discovers the truth about her sister, everybody's like, you can't tell, you can't say anything. Like, it's better to like leave things in the past, to not lie. And she really struggles with this whole, is it okay to lie? Are there times when the truth is helpful and or harmful? And how do I live with that, with owning that information and keeping that information from somebody? Immigration, I think it's important to kind of talk about, is illegal immigration is okay, and if your students don't believe it okay, how would they solve the problem? How do they see a way to solve this? And then also education. This is a book that talks a lot about how important education is to the protagonist, and also different literature that she has read and has changed her life, which I think is really, really cool, especially as English teachers. But I think it's important for your students to own the fact that like education shapes how we grow as people and who we are. So how does education affect my growth as a person? How does it add or take away to my identity? And I think that's something that's going to help your students own not only the knowledge, but also the rest of the education that they have. So three other books that I wanted to mention due to that deal with similar themes or similar kind of way of writing that I wanted to bring up is the ones on this page, obviously. So The Perks of Being a Wallflower by Stephen Chbosky. It's a great coming of age story about a boy who was sexually abused and also is dealing with mental health and how to relate not only with himself and his family, but also with friends, and how to get through like the crappiness of life sometimes. So I think that's something that would be really cool to pair with this book. Um, there's Americanized, Rebel Without a Green Card. It's a memoir by Sarah Sidi. She is an Iranian, um, she's an Iranian uh, refugee, and she talks about how like when she grew up, she came to a moment of like, oh my gosh, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm an illegal immigrant, and like how that shaped her and how she grew up with that knowledge, and who it shaped how she became to be. I think it's cool because it's also a nonfiction work. And I think that's something that your students can be able to be like, oh wow, this is like actually something real that happens, and like she really dealt with this. Um, then also the book Gabby, A Girl in Pieces. It is also talking a lot about a girl who's dealing with the Mexican culture and living in America, and how does she deal with her identity and who she is and who she wants to become. And it talks about how she's trying to navigate all this stuff while growing up. So I think this would be another really great book to pair with that. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. And I hope that you check this book out. It's totally worth it, and it will really add really deep conversations and enriched reading in your classroom.